name is Anne-Marie Porter. I'm at the American Institute of Physics in the Statistical Research Center. Some of you may be familiar with our physics trends flyers that we put around departments and our data on enrollments and degrees in physics. My background is in psychology, so I have a PhD in psychology and some specialty in sociology as well. I've been doing research for a long time, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. So in my talk today, I want to talk about successes and challenges, both. We want to identify both where we still have issues and where some gains have been made in representation, doctoral program experiences, and employment experiences. And most importantly, my job here today is to present data on the challenges and successes going on. I'm not really going to suggest particular interventions or advocacy efforts that we need to do, but I'm going to provide the data if other people want to use that data to base their own intervention efforts. So I'm going to breeze through some of these earlier slides since you've seen some of these statistics in the other presentations. As we know, women are underrepresented in physics right now. It has increased over time, as you can see, especially from the 70s. If you look in the last decade, like since 2010, there is a slight increase of maybe a percentage or two, but it's not increasing as quickly as people would probably hope, but it is still increasing. So as of 2018, women earned 22% of physics bachelor's degrees and earned 20% of physics doctorate degrees. And this is familiar. This is very similar to what Monica showed in her presentation. But if you look and compare it to other STEM fields, physics is all the way down here, along with engineering and computer science at only 20%. Now, compared to all fields, this is kind of surprising. So all fields is up here. That's the blue line. This is not just STEM fields. This is all fields at college and universities. Women are at 57%, so they're overrepresented at universities overall. And this is certainly the case for some sciences like biology. So it's surprising that women are still so underrepresented in certain fields. We see the same story for doctorates as well. They're not quite as represented overall in doctorates. They're a little above 45%. But once again, the distribution is similar, with more women being represented in biological sciences, and then physics, engineering, computer science are among the lowest in women's representation. As for minority women in physics, we looked at different ethnic groups, and we identified 3 groups that were underrepresented, being African American women, Hispanic American women, and Native American women. Native American women, they're a very small group, so we're not reporting the numbers here to protect their identifiability. If you only show that 10 women who are Native American graduated with a physics degree, it's easier to figure out who they are. But when we look at the trends over time, it's interesting to see how Hispanic American women, even though they're underrepresented, are increasing seemingly very quickly over time, whereas African American women are staying about the same. If you see this dip here, this decrease, look at that with a grain of salt, because the NCES iPad system, this is public data that we received this from, they changed their questionnaire in 2008, and they added a 2 or more races category. And the African American numbers here don't include people who selected 2 or more races. So that's why you're probably seeing a decrease here. So it's more likely that it remained the same over time. Now, when we look at physics departments, just like with bachelor's degrees and doctoral degrees, the representation of women is increasing across most ranks, actually. So even over almost the past 10 years, started at 14% women in departments, and now we're all the way up to 19% women. And we're seeing increases in full professor, associate professor, assistant professor, and instructor and adjunct ranks. So across the board, women seem to be better represented in departments more and more, and we expect that trend to continue over time. We're also seeing this with new hires. So the good news here is when we look from 2012 to 2016, more women are being hired into higher ranked positions, so tenured positions, tenure track positions, and permanent positions. And we're seeing a smaller amount of women being hired in full-time temporary positions or part-time positions. And what's actually surprising with some of the data I just looked at a month ago, for 2018 new hires data, 32% of the new hires across 90% of physics departments in the US were women, which is actually surprising since if you look a few years ago, you would expect there to be only 20% of women among the physics doctoral graduates. So women are actually being hired seemingly at greater rates in physics departments right now than you would expect. They're still underrepresented, but it's at a higher rate than you would expect compared to men. So next, I want to talk about some of our more exciting data. We collaborated with the International Council for Science on the Gender Gap in Science project. This was a global survey conducted with scientists around the world, and this is actually the first time we're going to be presenting some of the results from this data. So this project surveyed scientists in 159 unique countries in multiple disciplines, including physics. And we actually even had the survey translated into multiple languages and then translated the responses back into English so we could do the analysis. So for physics by itself, we had over 7,500 respondents, and 37% of those respondents were women. Now, this is not representative. So if you looked at the whole population of physicists, women would be far less represented, but we made an effort in this project to recruit more women specifically to hear their experiences through snowball sampling. So people would share the survey with their friends or other women they knew. And that's why this number is a little higher than what it probably is in the population. Now for all the gender differences I'm going to show you in the next few slides when we compare men and women, we did regressions for all of the variables we're going to look at. And what a regression does is it looks at the statistical significance of a finding. So not just looking at the difference in percentages, but seeing if this is probably something that's actually happening and not due to random chance. And in these regressions, we control for factors that might also explain these differences. So we control for age, the region of the world they live in, the level of development in the country, and for employment outcomes, we looked at their employment sector, meaning industry, academia, government, things like that. So by controlling for these things, we know that when we find significant differences, it is beyond these factors. So gender affects it, already considering age and country differences and employment sector differences into the equation. So here's our first slide on doctoral study experiences, and all of these factors were statistically significant. So there's some good news and bad news, I guess. The good news is overall, women are still having very positive experiences in doctoral programs around the world. So for program quality, you can see over 80% said that their program was excellent, very good, or good. About 80% said they had an excellent or good relationship with their advisor or mentor. And then for their experiences in the program, over 60% agreed that they were fairly treated in the program, and over 70% agreed that other students were respectful. Now, the less good news is we still see significant gender differences in these outcomes. So as you can see, women were less likely to rate their program quality, advisor relationship, and being fairly treated or respectfully treated. And so they had less positive experiences than men, even controlling for those other factors we talked about. We found similar outcomes for employment experiences. So once again, slightly less so, but women still overall had positive experiences. They agreed that they had support from their manager or boss, that they were fairly treated, and that their coworkers were respectful. But once again, these differences were significant, and women were less likely to rate these positive experiences compared to men. For discrimination and harassment, we're still finding that this is occurring according to women's reports. So over 50% of women said they experienced some form of gender discrimination in evaluations or assessments of their work. and 29% actually said that they personally encountered sexual harassment at their school or workplace. So we definitely see this is a big challenge that's happening for many women around the world. One thing to note here, this is a limitation of surveys. When you ask a survey question, they simply answer yes or no to if they've encountered sexual harassment, but I don't know the details of how they're defining sexual harassment or what actually happened. Later in the presentation, we're going to talk about some actual quotes that women gave, so we have more detail about these kinds of things. In terms of employment activities, so these were yes or no questions, we actually surprisingly found that there weren't any significant gender differences in most of the activities that we looked at. So both men and women were just as likely to be invited speakers, act as a boss or manager, be an editor of a journal, serve on a board of directors, or supervise graduate students. And the only two differences we found were men were more likely to supervise undergraduate students, and women were more likely to serve on conference organizing committees or conference planning committees. Now, the reason this is so interesting is we did another global survey 10 years ago, and we asked the exact same question, and in this survey we only surveyed physicists, but it was still around the world. And we actually did find gender differences in these activities, but we didn't find these differences this time around 10 years later. So I can see two potential explanations for this off the top of my head. One is we just have a very different sample. Once again, our sample is not perfectly representative of the population, and it could be differences in who we asked, or it actually could be that women are more likely to do these activities than 10 years ago, and we have seen some progress in this area. When we look at employment resources, this is a little bit of a different story. So this is similar to what we found 10 years ago. Women were significantly less likely to report having enough resources in their work. So this includes equipment, technical support, travel money, funding, clerical support, and having enough employees or students to help support their work. So we still found those gender differences as last time. These percentages here show how many women report having enough of something, so having enough equipment, having enough funding. Just to show that still a majority of women are reporting that they have enough, but compared to men, they're less likely to say that they have enough. Now, when we look at family influences, we see a lot of differences. So we know that 33% of women took a career break, and 2/3 of those women took it for family reasons, most specifically maternity leave reasons. That seemed to be the biggest factor. And then we asked, after becoming a parent, did you make certain changes in your work lifestyle? And women were significantly more likely to choose to spend less time at work, choose a more flexible schedule, report that their career promotion rate slowed after they had children, change their employer or field, become a stay-at-home parent, or a small percentage of them actually reported getting demoted or losing their job after becoming a parent. So this gives an idea of all the decisions and compromises women need to make after they have children that men are far less likely to make. But some of these things, like becoming a stay-at-home parent and losing a job, were reported by a very small percentage of women. So this isn't representative of all women's experiences in this study. So next I want to share some stories about successes and challenges. Once again, the limitations of a survey is you're really limited to asking yes or no kinds of questions in those closed-ended options. But we want to also analyze some open-ended options where people are more freely able to write about their experiences. And then you get some more detail that you're likely to lose in a survey. So I want to present some of those results as well. So the results I'm presenting here are not from the global survey. They're from a survey we did way back in 2011, which I know is a while ago. But we surveyed 1,860 mid-career physicists that received doctorates in physics. And we call them mid-career because they earned their doctorate 10 to 15 years prior from when we surveyed them. And this was limited to just the United States. Now, most of the physicists we talked about, uh, 45% of them were working in academia, but we actually were able to get a much higher percentage than we expected in the private sector. So the answers here are not just representative of academia by itself. And in this survey, 14% of the respondents were female, which if you look at the number of women that earned their PhDs 10 years before 2011, that's about what you would expect. So what we did for this study is we asked 2 questions in this larger survey: what has helped you succeed in your career, and what have been the barriers to your career? And I did some qualitative analysis to really look at the meaning and the themes that people were talking about in this study. Now, there were a lot of quotes to read over. There were over 1,700 quotes overall, which is a lot. So this is a big project and a big undertaking. And what you do in qualitative analysis, for those who aren't familiar, can someone mute their microphone? I'm hearing some movement in the background. All right, but I'll continue. But for this qualitative analysis, we organized these quotes into different categories, and I'll show you some examples of how we did that. And we did it inductively rather than deductively, which I'll explain a little bit more as well. But also just keep in mind, when you're doing any analysis of open-ended questions, you're only including those who chose to respond to that question. And if any of you have gotten teacher evaluations, you know that the students who are more likely to respond sometimes are the students who are less happy, that have the more extreme ends, either really positive or really negative experiences. So just keep that in mind when we're looking at these. So here's an example of how we did some of the qualitative analysis. So here's an example of one of the success quotes we got. So someone said that support and collaboration with intelligent and generous colleagues help them succeed. So that's the direct quote. And what you do is you do an open coding process. So to begin with, you do a category that's very close to what they said. So we would label that quote as supportive colleagues and collaborations as a success factor. And then over time, when you do that open coding process, you create a new code or category for every single quote. Then you look at them all together and see what patterns show up. And you can create these broader categories or buckets to organize them into. So we noticed that there were a lot of codes that were talking about social support. So they were talking about their colleagues or mentors or friends and family. So we created a broader category called like the social support factors category. And we looked at that. If you have more questions about how we did this process, I'm happy to answer that after the presentation. But this is just to give you an example of how we did it. So the same thing were for the barriers. So for instance, someone said, there are not many jobs in physics in my current location. So we did an open code and we named that difficulty obtaining employment. And then we create a broader category later that was career opportunity barriers, because there were a lot of different codes that were talking about challenges getting career opportunities. Right, so hopefully that clarifies a little bit how we did this. And the difference between inductively analyzing versus deductively. So if we were to do this deductively, we would have had these lists of categories in advance and then kind of put the codes into buckets based on this predetermined list. But in inductive, we don't do that. We don't have a list in advance, and we created these codes as we were reading them. And then after looking at all of them, we created these larger groups and categories. And this is so we don't miss any important information that people talk about. Because if you create a list in advance and assume that you already know what people are going to talk about, you're going to miss some details. Okay, so to look at success factors, these were the 6 overall categories. These are the types of success factors that men and women talked about. You can already see some interesting patterns here. So if you notice, overall, men and women tended to attribute their success to their own skills and abilities and their own personal drive. So personal drive being hard work, persistence, their motivation to succeed. And skills and abilities being like problem solving, programming, research, teaching, all sorts of skills. and they were less likely to attribute their success to more external factors like their organization. You also see some interesting differences in gender. So men were more likely to attribute their success to their education and career background. So this would be the good physics training they got at a doctoral program. This could be training they received at a previous job. They were also more likely to attribute their success to skills and abilities, like problem solving, research, and programming. And there's more than that too, but those are just some examples. Whereas women were more likely to attribute their success to social support of mentors, friends and family, and students and colleagues. So this already shows some differences in how men and women view their success in their careers and how they got there. So when we did the individual open codes, there were 47, which we probably can't list in this one presentation, but they're all listed in the report that's available on the SRC's website if you want to see them all in detail. So here we're just going to list the 10 most frequently discussed factors. We're just going to focus on those. So it's interesting when you look at men and women, the ones that are bolded here are the ones that are unique. So in the top 10, men talked a lot about experience in certain fields and how that helped them succeed. So certain fields being their subfield in physics, mathematics, computer science, those were the common ones that they talked about. Whereas women were more likely than men to talk about the support of friends and family in particular and how that helped them succeed. Now, men also talked about how friends and family helped them succeed, but it just wasn't in the top 10 most frequently discussed. It's down much lower in the list. So it just shows that women were more likely to talk about and value the role of friends and family. But what's really interesting is that everything else is very similar. So we look, both of them thought hard work was really important, the most important thing in their success. A lot of other things were very similar, like persistence, certain skills like problem-solving skills, interpersonal skills like collaborating and communicating, the role of mentors and colleagues in their success, how important being passionate for your work is, how important it is to have a good education, and important in being flexible in your work, meaning you're willing to try new things, do new tasks, maybe change fields, and adapt with the times rather than sticking to just one narrow thing. So here's actually some direct quotes from the women in this study about how they succeeded: hard work and persistence, deep love of physics, astronomy, and teaching, working in a good team, excellent training I received in graduate school, being able to adapt to new situations, their family and the support of the community, and great mentors who helped show me how to make good decisions. Now, barriers are a totally different story. We found very different things here. Now, it's interesting how with successes, people attribute that more to themselves, like their own skills and hard work, but barriers, they mostly talk about outside or external factors within their organization or the job market itself. That's what they mainly focus on. So organizational barriers were the top one, and a lot of that had to do with having enough funding, resources, but also about the work environment that they had to deal with, or the likelihood of their business or industry closing. So those are the issues that they were really focusing on the most when they talked about barriers. And men talked about it a lot more than women did. Other slight differences, men were more likely to talk about how the lack of certain skills and abilities were a challenge for them. Women were more likely to talk about how social issues were a bigger challenge for them, issues with mentors or colleagues, or family obligation issues. And then, of course, when we look at gender, race, or ethnicity barrier, women were far more likely to talk about that. Most of this percentage is due to gender bias reporting, issues with gender in their department or at their company. So this is something that's talked about a lot more by women than men. So let's go into the specifics now. So if you look here, the types of barriers they discussed were very different in terms of frequency. Some of it was very similar. So both men and women talked about lack of funding as being a major problem, overwork, Difficulty obtaining employment in the job market, there being not enough jobs, or um, some people in industry reported that they wouldn't be hired because they had a PhD. That was another big problem. Balancing family obligations like childcare, and issues with managers or upper management in their company. But there are some big differences where men talked about lack of funding as their most important problem, whereas women talked about balancing those family obligations as their biggest struggle in the workplace. Now, if you look at some of the unique stuff they talk about, you see some really interesting things. So, unsurprisingly, the second most discussed barrier was gender bias for women. Mostly not getting as much resources as men, not being respected by their colleagues or mentors. And then number 3 was issues with mentorship, having mentors that either neglected them or gave them bad advice or were disrespectful of them. That was another issue they talked about. Difficulty relocating for work. They talked about being unable to move for a job. They didn't specifically say it was due to family reasons, but it possibly could have been. They just didn't specify it, but it's likely if they had children or certain people they need to take care of, they wouldn't be able to move. Having less staff, students, or equipment for their work, and also being isolated, so not having enough networks or contacts for research collaborations was a big problem. But it's also important to look at what's unique for men too, because they have very different barriers that they talk about. Lack of interpersonal skills is number 3. Women discussed that too, but it was much further down the list for them. So men really struggled with not self-promoting enough, not being able to communicate well, not having issues with collaborating, and not that there were interpersonal issues, more like they didn't know how to do it. A lot of them talked about their own biases that they experienced in the workplace, particularly about their subfield. So they would say like, well, people don't respect my subfield in physics, or I work with engineers and they don't respect my physics background, or at my company they don't respect that I do research. Things like that, and they report a lot of issues with that, both in departments and companies. Unsupportive administration. So this is more like bureaucratic issues in terms of getting permission to do things, sometimes some security clearance issues as well. Difficulty advancing at work was a major problem for them, not being able to get promoted into management positions. They would report getting pigeonholed into technical positions because of their scientific background, and they would be told, well, you're just not a good fit for management. But after a while, that's the only way they can move up in the corporate chain. And then a lot more of them talked about just not being interested in their work, not really being excited about what they were doing, and that was a bigger issue for them. So here's some women's quotes about barriers. They talked about poor advice and mentoring. Since my children were born, many aspects of my career have been much more difficult. Being a member of a dual physics career couple has limited my employment choices. No one at my college that I can collaborate with on research. Being the only woman in a group of 40 or so physicists was extremely difficult. And the inability of male peers to see me as an intellectual equal. So these are all examples of issues they talked about. So here are the conclusions, since we just have a few minutes left. There's good news and bad news. The number of women is increasing over time, especially in academic departments, even though women are still underrepresented in physics. Overall, keep in mind that most women reported positive experiences in doctoral programs and employment, 60 to 80%, depending on the question they were asked. But they still report less positive experiences than men, so we're still seeing these gender differences. And we still see reports of sexual harassment and discrimination going on. And we also see another big takeaway is that women are making more career compromises for family reasons and childcare. And once again, when we looked at the barriers a minute ago, family obligations was their number 1 barrier. So that's something they're definitely struggling with. How can we help women succeed? Once again, I'm not here to suggest specific interventions, but based on our findings, these are just a few of the variables we know women are struggling with. So maternity leave and childcare support seem to be really important, and how to get back on your feet after that maternity leave and that career break, and deal with that. Good mentor relationships, just like Marie was saying in her talk, really important, especially in doctoral programs. Having support from colleagues and getting those collaboration opportunities, really important. And addressing those gender bias issues as well in different sectors of employment. So that's everything I had to talk about today. Here's my contact information if you have any follow-up questions that you want to ask me about. And thank you to all my colleagues that help do all of their surveys and all the work that we do at the Statistical Research Center. It's a group effort. It's not just me.